Look, here's the weirdest thing about the wizarding world. The person who did the most damage wasn't the most powerful wizard or the most charismatic leader. It was a scared, sniveling little man who turned into a rat. Peter Pettigrew is the least impressive name you can imagine, but his choice is gigantic, cataclysmic. Think about the moment in the Shrieking Shack when Sirius says he cut Lily and James's throats. He killed them. And Pettigrew finally squeals, "No, no, I didn't. I didn't." The line hits because it's not just denial. It's the sound of someone who has been running his whole life, and now he's cornered by the consequences. I couldn't have told you. I couldn't. That's not just cowardice. That's moral abdication. And here's the thing. The story doesn't treat Pettigrew as a tragedy of circumstance only. It keeps showing us, in detail, how his decisions connect like a chain. He fakes his death, becomes a rat for 12 years, and lives off his old friend's pity. Then, when things get dangerous, he flips. I had orders. He scuttles in front of Voldemort, but listen to what he actually does with those orders. He lies to protect himself. He gives up others. He chooses survival over loyalty every single time. Why does that matter? Why does this squeaky little betrayal lead to so much pain? Because Pettigrew is the hinge that opens the door for Voldemort. Listen to the cold economy of his confession in that barn scene. He told me he wanted to come back. He needed a body. He needed his old bones. Pettigrew gives Voldemort the one thing he couldn't get by power alone: access. He cuts his own friends' throats in the currency of cowardice and hands their killer the key. That's not just a plot device. That's a moral argument embedded in the story. Weakness in the wrong hands destroys everything. Remember how the movie shows that little silver hand? It's a symbol. It's mechanical, tidy, obedient. Everything Pettigrew is not, except obedient when it benefits him. When Voldemort summons him with the summons in the Goblet of Fire, Pettigrew doesn't hesitate. He literally fashions a plan to bring Voldemort back because he's terrified of being found out, terrified of consequences. He whispers, I was a coward. I didn't even see them die. He confesses to protecting himself at the cost of others, and yet there's almost relief in his voice because survival beats everything. Is it fair to say the wizarding world was shaped more by the weak than the mighty? Look at the causal line. Pettigrew betrays the Potters by revealing the hiding place. Voldemort kills them, then loses power. Years later, Pettigrew, motivated by fear and self-preservation, helps resurrect Voldemort. That resurrection leads directly to the First and Second Wizarding Wars, untold deaths, and the dismantling of normal life. Hundreds, maybe thousands of lives hinge on the act of one man who couldn't do the hard thing when it mattered. That's not dramatic hyperbole. That's the story's architecture. And it keeps giving us scenes that underline this theme. When Dumbledore says in other moments that the choices of ordinary people matter, he isn't abstractly moralizing. He's pointing at moments like this. Pettigrew's rat tail flick and trembling hand are tiny, but they unlock history. Even the map's famous phrase, mischief managed, is bitter when you remember Pettigrew used the map's betrayal to survive. The text keeps nudging us. Power without principle is meaningless. But even a little principle, or the lack of it, scales. Look at the Goblet of Fire scene where Pettigrew is asked, "Why did you do it?" He replies quietly, "Because I was afraid." That's it. No noble motive, no tragic flaw like hubris, just fear. It's a blunt, almost embarrassing confession. And yet it's the fulcrum. His fear strings together the worst sequences in the books, the Potter's deaths, the return of Voldemort, the terror that follows. It's the kind of ordinary failing that doesn't feel epic in the moment, but ripples outward in waves. What really gets me is how the movies let the dialogue do the heavy lifting. "You betrayed my parents," Sirius screams. Pettigrew's pathetic answer, "I didn't want to die." The line reduces heroics to a bargain. Choose to live, and you will cost others their lives. The camera frames Pettigrew's small shrinking, while the words expanding to catastrophe. It's cinematic economy that sharpens the moral point. History isn't only carved by the bold. Often, it's the faint-hearted who tilt the scale. And think about the legal and social structures that enable this. Pettigrew stages his death and is believed. No one looks closely. He assumes a role as caretaker to the Weasleys of all places and lives comfortable until fear unravels him. That sequence asks us to consider accountability. It's not enough to be the least powerful in skill. You must be responsible. Pettigrew's lack of courage is paired with social negligence, friends, authorities, an entire system that lets one lie go unchallenged. Let's dig into a moment people sometimes miss when Pettigrew pleads for his life in front of the other Death Eaters. He's essentially saying, "Remember me as useful." That's the pathetic calculus of a man who thinks his value is his utility. He doesn't believe in loyalty or principle. He only believes in being useful enough to not be killed. That short-term thinking is exactly what empowers long-term tragedy. The movies dramatize it with his twitching, his stuttering. "Master is back," he whispers, satisfied with a career move that will keep him alive. But what does that do? It resurrects a tyrant. Another reason this matters. If Pettigrew had done the opposite, if he'd accepted his punishment, if he'd come clean sooner, if he'd refused to help Voldemort reanimate, the chain breaks. It's almost a cruelly simple moral. The world survives if a coward decides once to be brave. But Pettigrew never does. He flinches at each crossroads. "I couldn't stand the thought of death," he says, but the cost of that stance is incalculable. It's not heroic to imagine he had no choice. The story keeps nudging us to see that choices always exist, even for the weak. Think about the emotional weight of Sirius pointing at Pettigrew and shouting, "You are a murderer!" The collapse in Pettigrew's face isn't just fear. It's recognition that his survival ruined others. There's almost a terrible, brief remorse, but it's too late. He tries to bargain, "If you kill me, you'll never know peace," or whatever his scrambling line is. That bargaining is so telling. He treats the lives destroyed as abstract, as collateral. He won't accept personal responsibility, which circles back to the larger thematic claim. The books and the films are obsessed with the ethics of ordinary people. They reward bravery, but also punish cowardice through consequence rather than immediate poetic justice. Voldemort is horrifically powerful, sure, but his return requires a quiet, shameful act by a man trying to hide a past. The narrative keeps asking, who really shapes history? The heroes who act, or the weak who choose incorrectly? Pettigrew's arc argues for the latter, and it's profoundly disturbing. And then there's the visual metaphor, rat. Small, quick, able to disappear. It's perfect. Rats are survivalists. They eat what's left and run when the light comes. Naming him Wormtail is supposed to make him repulsive, and it does, but it's also accurate. The animal imagery is not only aesthetic, it's moral. The films use close-ups of Pettigrew's twitchy hands, his rat-like face, his tiny mouth forming crucial lies. Each image reinforces the thesis. The story's greatest tragedies are not the result of immense power alone, but ordinary betrayal from a man who chose himself. So, when you watch those scenes again, don't just ask, how could Sirius be so angry? Ask instead, how did this little choice create a war? The answer cuts through romantic ideas about destiny. It reveals a bleak but truthful picture. History sometimes turns on the smallest acts of cowardice. And that should terrify us because those moments are so human and so easily replicable. At the end of the day, Peter Pettigrew is an uncomfortable mirror. He shows what can happen when survival outweighs conscience. He shows that not all power is loud. Sometimes history is quietly handed to the worst people because someone too frightened to stand up chose comfort over courage. That's the tragedy of his story, and maybe the story's most important lesson. So yeah, he was pathetic. He was a rat. He was useless in a wand duel and skilled only at hiding. But those qualities made him dangerous in a specific, devastating way. He didn't need to be powerful to wreak havoc. He only needed to be weak enough to stab his friends in the back. That's not just a character flaw, that's a theme. And it makes the Harry Potter saga, for all its spells and prophecies, feel far more like human history. full of small, shameful acts that change everything.